You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NiShacks.
Hi everyone, you're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how you doing?
Great.
Where are you calling in from? Nice. How long are you there for?
I'm here for 3 days. I'm actually leaving here tonight. It's been a wonderful visit.
Good, glad to hear that. All right, so we had some pretty big updates on USTR just before the weekend, so I think our listeners are pretty eager to hear about that. We should go ahead and get started there. What are the changes? Are they good, bad, just different?
Well, good or bad, that of course is a somewhat subjective view. Definitely different on some counts. I think the most important thing is to take a look at what has changed and what is new. If we take one of the major changes, especially if you're a U.S. exporter, the requirements for U.S. exporters to use U.S. flag and eventually U.S. built ships has been removed. And I think that would cause a lot of exporters to breathe a sigh of relief in that specific element. There's also another element here that is materially different. All container vessels smaller than 4,000 TEU are now exempt. And furthermore, shorter journeys, less than 2,000 nautical miles, also exempt. And it appears to me that this is very clearly an exemption aimed at trying to keep the whole trade between US and the Caribbean exempt from all of these surcharges, irrespective of what vessels they're actually using. So if you are directly exposed to the Caribbean trade or US exporter, this is definitely good news in and of itself. Then there are a few other things that have changed. In the old USTR, if your ship was built in China, but if you somewhere in your fleet had ships built in China, all your other ships would pay. Same if you had orders in China. Both of these requirements are now also gone. So for container ships, we're basically down to it's only ships larger than 4,000 TEU. If you are then a Chinese operator, which in this case, the relevant ones for the US would obviously be the major shipping lines, COSCO and the OOCL, and you also got the smaller niche carrier, ED shipping, they would all be subject to this. So they are Chinese carriers, doesn't matter where their ships are built, all of their ships are going to have to pay. And if you actually do have a Chinese built ship, that will have to pay as well. It doesn't matter who you are. Now, in the old proposal, there were fixed fees per port call. This has also been changed. It's not a fixed fee and it's not per port call. Instead, it's per journey to the US. So if you have, for example, typical transatlantic service that might go from Europe then to 3 ports on the US East Coast and back, it only pays a fee once for that ship, no matter how many port calls it has. That's also a change. The cost now is, for the Chinese lines, it's a cost per net ton of vessel, basically a measure of the size of the vessel. And herein lies some of the challenge. This is phased in gradually, starting at $50 per net ton of vessel here in October, and then it's gradually ramped up to a full phase-in in April 2028 at $140. The challenge here is we usually think of vessel sizes in terms of TEU and not in terms of net ton. The indication right now are for some of the large ships that come in, especially the ones to the US Eastern Seaboard, this could be fees that would be going up to $10 million per ship. Very different than the $1 million. There was actually in the old proposal also $1 per ton, but it was capped at that $1 million fee. These new ones are not capped in the new proposal. That's why it can go all the way up to $10 million. If you then look at Chinese built ships, so that could be any of the carriers, as long as the ship is built, it's a lower fee per ton, but for the very largest ones, you would be looking up to somewhere around $2 to $2.5 million per ship. Again, this is higher than the $1 million fixed fee, and this is where, again, it becomes complicated. Is this higher or lower? Well, if the ship goes in and calls just one port, like you typically see on a US West Coast, then it's definitely higher. If it's on the US East Coast and you call 3 ports, but you only pay once, it's lower. So it's not a matter of this necessarily higher or lower. It depends on how you operate the ships. And because it depends on how you operate the ships, just like with the old proposal, the new proposal will indeed cause the shipping lines to do significant changes to the networks. It's just the network changes now will be slightly different. But we start with the specific extremely high fees here on the Chinese lines. If, and I say if, because there's yet again a hearing period. This might get changed again, just like everything else. We talk about it, then it changes. But we have to look at what does it mean as it is. This, of course, is going to impact Ocean Alliance very, very hard, because that's Costco, OOCL, and then Evergreen and CMACU. And if they maintain these 10 mil up to, I have to say up to, because smaller ships, of course, pay less. They maintain these extremely high fees on Chinese operators. To me, it is evident what will happen. Ocean Alliance will make sure that all the services going into US are operated by CMA, CGM, or Evergreen, at least to the extent possible. They will then use ships that they currently use on, for example, Asia, Europe, and other trades to phase over to the US, whereas Costco and OOCL will then increasingly service Asia to Europe, because that would be the way to minimize these extremely high fees. They will basically have no choice but to do that. For Chinese-built ships for everyone, it will be the same story. A lot of ships are built in China, so they are unlikely to completely avoid calling the US with Chinese-built ships. I think that's going to be an impossibility, but they can reduce it. And again, saying if I have a Chinese and a non-Chinese built ship, well, the Chinese built ship will operate on Asia, Europe. The non-Chinese ship will go between Asia and North America. Simple as that. Then you have all the niche carriers. They exist especially on the Pacific going into US West Coast. You've got quite a bunch of them. They are operating relatively small ships. To some degree, they are below the 4,000 TEU threshold. So we're going to have an interesting dynamic there. And that's a dynamic you might also see on the main alliance carriers. We tend to think in terms of vessels 10 to 14, 15,000 TEU, but ships on the Atlantic from Europe to the US and from South America up to the US, a lot of them are in the range of, I would say, 3 to 6,000 TEU, which means for all the carriers, it now becomes a matter of calculating the nitty-gritty. What is best? Operating a 5,000 TEU ship with larger scale advantage, but having to pay a fee, or downsizing to a 4,000 TEU ship with higher slot costs and more fuel burn, more emissions per TEU, but you avoid the fee. And that's something the carriers are extremely good at, calculating what is the lowest cost option. That's why there's going to be a significant change in a lot of these setups, also with the new USTR. I think that was a lot of at least the highlights that we had there.
Yeah, it's a good summary of all the changes. I think if the carriers change to a smaller vessel, you'll probably see an increase in rates because there's less slots, same demand.
There are. You can say that's a segue over to what is happening now. But before we go that far, I think we should also think through for anyone interested in the charter markets for vessels. If the USTR is implemented as it is, suddenly a 4,000 TEU Chinese-built ship is going to be much more attractive than a 4,100 TEU Chinese-built ship. So you might see an odd pricing behavior on charter rates for Chinese-built ships, where ships just below 4,000 TEU would become more valuable than ships just above 4,000 TEU, simply because of the US fees.
Yeah, and you might end up having trouble finding one that's 4,000 or less if this is what goes through.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the net ton and why they, or if you have theories on why they landed on that. I've seen people talking about that being kind of an odd factor to go by.
Yeah, it is an odd factor, and I don't have any knowledge as to why they chose it. I don't know any reason why they would do it. They keep to net ton when it comes to Chinese operated vessels. When it comes to Chinese built ships, it's actually either per net ton or per TEU, and you have to pay the highest. It appears it's quite likely it's the net ton that's going to be highest. But why they chose to go down that path, I don't have any theory on that. I'll just note that, okay, for whatever reason, that made it in.
And you'd mentioned that to the East Coast, it's usually between 3,000 and 6,000 TEU vessels on average. Do you know what it is going into the U.S. West Coast?
Yeah, again, when I said into the East Coast, that is specifically for vessels coming from Europe and from South America. The ones coming from Asia, they are up to 15, 16,000 TEU. Those are the mega ships. If you look over on the U.S. West Coast, as far as I recall right now, the average vessel size, Asia to U.S. West Coast, is around 8,000. And I think that's something a lot of people also tend to forget, because the headlines are always on the mega ships, on the very large ships. But it's actually not the mega ships and the very large ships that make up the bulk of the vessels that go into the US West Coast. They are somewhat small. And maybe also, I was about to say in that same vein, I've seen statistics, I don't know to what degree they're credible, but with the exemption of ships below 4,000 TEU and also journeys less than 2,000 nautical miles, something like 90% of vessel arrivals that are exempt. That does not mean 90% of the cargo. It just means there's a lot of very, very small ships that go between all of the Caribbean nations and also go down to US Virgin Islands and all these places down there. That, of course, makes for a lot of port calls, but not a lot of containerized cargo.
Do you know roughly if the 2,000 nautical miles covers South America to the U.S.?
When I sat down and looked at it, it does cover if you go, for example, from Panama to Florida. I actually think it covers you all the way up to Charleston. So with the 2,000 nautical mile, now keep in mind the interpretation, as I understand it, is you cannot say I have a ship from Shanghai that then stops in Freeport and then it's only a short hop over to the US. That doesn't count. It has to be a self-contained short service. But it does mean I could sail big ships to the major transshipment hubs in the Caribbean. So I could sail big ships into, say, Freeport or Kingston, and then just have a smaller service within the 2,000 miles. Also, with big ships go further up. Of course, that would also have a cost. It would have a transshipment cost. It will make transit times longer. And as everything else, this is about money. So what is the least cost? Is it the cheapest to do transshipment, or is it the cheapest to pay the fee? And what the carriers will do is extremely easy. They will do whatever is lowest cost here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of number crunching going on right now as we figure out what the solution might be here.
Exactly. And just like there was with the first USTR, I still think it's important for everybody to know this can change again. As I mentioned, there's another hearing phase. The deadline is, I believe it's May 14th. I'm not quite sure on the date off the top of my head, but it's right around there. So given that from the first to the second iteration, there was definitely massive changes based on the hearings. We might see changes in this one, again, based on the hearings. We just don't know.
Yeah. So definitely now is the time to voice feedback and your opinion. All right, well, let's switch over to some market news. What else are we seeing right now throughout the market?
What we're seeing is continued, I was about to say, expected fallout from the extreme uncertainty around the tariffs. Tariffs themselves haven't changed since we spoke last. I was about to say that's a first. Of course, it's nice, but nobody out there seems to believe that this stability is here to stay. I mean, we are still proceeding into this 90-day of just keeping the reciprocal tariffs on pause. They might come in. Nobody has any faith in terms of what tariff changes might come down the line. So I think the most important thing that we've seen in the last week is we continue to hear more or less anecdotal evidence that a lot of shippers are just forcing shipments out of China any which way that they can. At the same time, they are trying to ramp up production and move cargo as rapidly as they can from other locations before the 90-day pause in tariffs up. And of course, that's an extremely uncertain and volatile environment to be in. Where we have more up-to-date data would typically be on the capacity side, where if you look at capacity, some of the data that came out from Sea Intelligence just yesterday showed that there are some of the weeks ahead of us where we see up to 40% of blank capacity. That is an extreme amount of capacity. This is something you typically only see after Chinese New Year, for example, when everybody also goes on vacation out of China. So this is pretty extreme, to put it mildly.
And this is 40% blanked coming from China specifically?
This is 40% blanked. As far as I recall, it's about the week where it's worst from Asia to the East Coast is about 40%, where it's worst from Asia to the West Coast is about 30% blank. And here's a technicality I think also often gets lost in translation. A decline in blank sailings is not equal to the same year-on-year decline in capacity. Because when you measure how much capacity is blank, you measure it versus what was planned, right? And if the planned capacity was the same as last year, it would also mean the same reduction. That's not the case. Carriers have phased in a lot more capacity compared to last year. And last year they had a little bit of blanking, not to this extreme. So when I also look at year-on-year capacity change, a 40% blanking does not mean a 40% drop in capacity. When I look at where it's worst into U.S. West Coast, we might have some weeks ahead of us where we are thinking, I think I saw data down to about 12% decline in capacity year on year. So I think that's important for everyone also to realize when you see numbers on how many ships or how much capacity blank, that is not the same as it's the same decrease in capacity year on year because the baseline capacity has increased. Those two numbers are different. But despite the two numbers being different, they do show the same thing, massive removal. And the removal of capacity started to ramp up drastically 2 weeks ago. Last week, it continued to ramp up even further, clearly showing that the carriers are removing capacity as rapidly as they can, which is to me is the strongest proof that yes, demand is plummeting completely out of China because nobody really wants to ship at 145% tariff if they in any which way can avoid it. And avoid it does not necessarily mean doing any kind of shenanigans. Avoiding simply means let's wait and see if this works itself out. I would hate to pay 145% only to see that tariff removed a week or 2 weeks down the line.
Yeah.
Final one I want to mention on the tariffs when I said that there had really been no changes. There hasn't. The only thing I think everybody should keep an eye on is the statement that came out of China today. Yesterday, where the Chinese government basically said, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but all the countries that want to negotiate with the US for the US to lower the tariffs, I mean, that's no business of China. They can, of course, negotiate any deal they want with the US. However, if any third country negotiates a deal with the US that involves that third country raising tariffs or penalizing China, China would then retaliate against that third country. So that is very, very clearly a warning shot from China that if any country out there will use this as an opportunity to curry favor with the US in exchange for raising tariffs on China, China would retaliate. And given how China has responded to the trade war with the US, I think that's a very credible threat.
Have we already seen other countries levying tariffs against China, or is this more of a
we have
just to get
not.
ahead of the situation should it arise?
I think exactly. I think that's just the Chinese government getting ahead of the situation. The only point where we have actually seen the US try to do that explicitly is the new USTR. In the new USTR, it states that the US Secretary of State has to go to all the US allies and convince them to also put $1 million fees on Chinese shipping.
All right. Well, interesting updates. I wanted to kind of circle back to what you were saying about capacity being one way of seeing the impact on the market with all of the tariff and USTR changes. Are there other ways that we can see how the market is being affected in more real time?
Yeah, it is a good question. And basically, it boils down to how do we know what we know? And when we talk about what is happening in the market, how much confidence do we actually have that what we're saying reflects reality? And we do have a challenge on some of the data in this industry. If we start at one end, say, how do we know demand? Demand is probably the most difficult one right now to know at an updated level. The demand sources that are typically out there, the most credible one would be container trade statistics. It's horribly inaccurate. It comes out a month after the fact. So for tactical purposes, it can be used. It's accurate, but it's lagged. Then I know there are a lot of people that look at port statistics, especially in the US, where you have outfits like Pierce that have extremely accurate data on demand, all the way down to how many dry 20-footers were imported from Albania to New Jersey in a specific week. That data actually exists, and it exists relatively quickly. But the challenge here is that is measured when the cargo clears customs in the US, so on the destination side, which again is 2, 4, 6 weeks delayed compared to when this cargo was loaded, and basically up to 2 months from when this cargo was booked. So data like Pierce are extremely granular. It gives the illusion of up-to-date data, but in reality it is not, because up-to-date means knowing supply-demand situation at the time of booking, not at the time when the cargo actually arrives. So for demand, overall there is a tricky situation. There are some out there, I think some might have seen some of the data from Vision, for example, saying that they had data. I think they are tapping in likely to some of the electronic booking portals where there are data on electronic bookings. That at least gives a glimpse into what is happening. But overall, from a container shipping perspective, demand is the Achilles heel in terms of knowing what happens. Basically updated. Capacity helps. There are different outfits out there that provide very much up-to-date capacity because you can basically map out and see which named vessels are departing which ports and when, where do they blank sailings. So you get very granular knowledge. I was quoting Sea Intelligence before. You can also get data from Alpha Liner, from Analytica, from EC. There's a bunch of different providers that actually can provide capacity data. So when you look at supply and demand, supply is a lot more granular. It can be a lot more up to date than demand can be. And that's also why capacity data in this particular situation right now is a good way of gauging what is happening on the demand side. Because if we can see on capacity, which we can see factually, a lot of sailings suddenly not being there, that is a surefire indication that the demand is not there either. Now, of course, you could say, well, they're just removing capacity to jerk the rates up. Well, they're not. Because that's, again, when we then match up to what do we then know on the rate side. And you said that's then the third part of this triangle. To which degree do we actually know rates? And the answer first would be, which rates are we talking about? Are we talking spot rates? Are we talking contract rates? What are we talking about? And again, there are different providers out there ranging from Container Trade Statistics, again, being the all-encompassing one, because they include an enormous amount of data on what moved, both spot and contract. But it is aggregated, it is lagged, again, a bit over a month from it's actually measured until it comes out. So for practical, tactical purposes, it can't really be used. Then you have other providers out there. I think the most well-known one would be the SCFI Spot Rate Index that was launched 15 years, 16 years ago or so. They're basically the first one to try to launch it. Since then, there's been multiple other spot rate indices that have been launched out there. I think the WCI from Drewry is probably one of the more well-known ones, and then ranging to providers both from Drewry and Seneta that also provide indices on, for example, what is happening on contract rates. If you want to measure the strength or at least get an idea of it, usually the spot rate indices are the go-to ones, because if there is a massive change, suddenly ships are not full at all, spot rates tend to react very rapidly and drop, and if there's insufficient capacity, they tend to go up very rapidly. All of them suffer from a range of different methodological choices and issues, of course, because you've got to ask yourself, how do they get these data? And especially when it comes to spot rates, you can either go down the route and ask stakeholders, be that carriers, be that forwarders, be that shippers, no, not shippers if it's spot rates in this case, but be that carriers, forwarders, what rates have you been quoting this week? And you can then try to amalgamate that. That to some degree is how, for example, SCFI is done. What spot rates were quoted this week? You can then have a mechanism to try to verify, is that true, or are you trying to manipulate the index? You don't want that to happen. So there are some checks and balances you can put in. The Achilles heel still there is, you know what has been quoted. You don't necessarily know how much cargo has then moved, because not every shipper pays the same. Of course they don't. There are various rates. It matters whether you are doing a one-off shipment and you never ship usually, or you are booking 20, 30 on spot every single week. So of course there is a whole range of rates out there, and for an index you can only get one number. And if you just average the different numbers but don't know how much cargo have moved at different levels, you still get at least quite a level of uncertainty in all of these spot rates. Same goes for some of the indices that are out there for contracts. Some of them have extremely deep data knowledge on contracts. They have a lot of contract rates, which provides for a very granular use of data, which is great. And it provides also a benchmark for what other shippers in the market signing up for in terms of contract levels. That is great. But you don't necessarily, again, know how much cargo de facto is then moved against these spot rates. So that is basically where the market is. The final one I want to mention, and that of course we're going to cover a lot more in our segment a week from now. That's going to be fun. That's the new index that's going to be launched from NYSEX as well, which is going to be a spot rate index. But this one unlike some of the other ones, are actually a spot rate based on the knowledge of actual cargo being moved at that specific level. So the index level that comes out is actually weighted directly in terms of how much. So yes, there might be somebody that booked at $8,000, but if that's one container and then there is 1,000 containers that's been moved at $2,000, it doesn't matter that this one ridiculous rate out there is actually the genuine market in terms of how much volume was de facto booked at a specific rate that's going to count. So that's going to add yet another data point into it when we then try to sit down here every week and ascertain how strong, how weak is the market, and which way is the wind blowing, basically.
Yeah, I think the industry is going to be really excited about the NYSEX indices that are going to be launched. I think one of the big differentiators is also the governing board and how the methodology is established for calculating the index rates. It's a bit more transparent than some of the other indices that we've spoken about, and so I think that's a big plus as well.
Yeah, no, and we'll have much more time next week where we're going to dive a lot more into the index and what it can be used for. But that's a week from now. We don't know what the world looks like a week from now, about to say, but let's see what changes in the land of tariff landscapes. The last thing I want to throw out, just again, to indicate how quickly things tend to change, is not a containerized one, but rather a small parcel one, where, of course, I think everybody has noticed the abolition of the de minimis rule. So you have to pay if it's under $800, and there's been a lot of focus on that. What I found particularly interesting to note was the sudden announcement by DHL to suspend all parcels over $800 to consumers coming into the US. So it's not the B2B market, but the B2C market for parcels valued over $800. Apparently you cannot use DHL right now. My own personal guess on that, and that is just, that's on me, it might be DHL views it completely differently, but my read on that one is there is just too much hassle and work associated with it, with all the changes in the tariffs. Because imagine this, imagine John Smith sitting in Arizona somewhere is ordering a parcel for himself at goods valued at $1,000, and suddenly the tariffs change again. Then DHL delivers his package and tells him, "Dear John, you need to pay freight, and on top of that, you also just need to pay another $2,000 in tariff because tariffs just changed." I was about to say, good luck in getting John Smith to pay $2,000 in tariff when he's already paid $1,000 for his parcel. I think this would become an administrative nightmare for a lot of the transportation providers out there. I simply don't think from a practical perspective they are geared to suddenly handle what potentially could be tens of thousands of private individuals they would need to chase up for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in tariffs. That would be extremely onerous to do. My guess is that might be part of the reasoning why they temporarily suspend this acceptance. And if that's the case, I might expect other transportation providers to do the same.
Yeah, it's an interesting update. And I'm not sure if you mentioned specifically that it's only out of China, but that's the case, right? It's DHL is only suspending from China. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they release in the coming weeks about that, if they clarify more. But I think you're probably right about the administrative nightmares. All right. Well, I think that's everything for today's episode. A lot of juicy information. So thank you, Lars, for sharing and talking through it with us. As we mentioned, next week we'll have a more in-depth episode talking about the NYSEX index or the indices that we're developing. So stay tuned for that. It'll be a very monumentous episode for us. We'll talk next week. And until then, I hope things don't change too much. But if they do, you'll learn about it here with us. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NYSEX. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.